Aurelia stood barefoot in the hallway of her own penthouse, heels hanging loosely from her fingers, the thin straps pressed into her palm. The carpet felt cool beneath her feet, a small detail that stood out only because everything else had sharpened into focus. Music drifted through the closed bedroom door ahead of her. Low, controlled, familiar in rhythm, unfamiliar in choice. It wasn't loud enough to announce itself, yet it carried ease, the kind that assumes privacy without question. She didn't move. This moment didn't ask for drama. It didn't arrive suddenly or demand reaction. It felt exact, like the final confirmation of something already known. The sound coming from behind the door wasn't a surprise. It was an answer. Earlier that evening, she was supposed to be airborne, crossing state lines with a neatly packed excuse and a predictable return time. A work trip, 3 days. The kind of absence that creates space rather than concern. Only she hadn't left the city. She hadn't even left the block. She had paused long enough to listen to the feeling she'd been postponing. People talk about betrayal as a single act, a clear break. What they don't often explain is how it usually begins much earlier, with small permissions granted quietly. One overlooked moment, one softened question, one decision to let discomfort slide in the name of peace. Over time, respect doesn't disappear loudly. It becomes optional. Aurelia shifted her shoes into one hand and rested the other against the wall. The paint was smooth, recently redone at Silas's request. He liked things refreshed often, new colors, new furniture, new versions of old explanations. Standing there, she understood with calm certainty that this wasn't the first time she had been absent while still being present. It was simply the first time she had stopped explaining it away. Truth, she had learned, rarely announces itself. It doesn't force its way in or demand urgency. It waits, patiently, until you stop defending the version of events that no longer fits. Earlier, in the kitchen, Silas had leaned against the counter and mentioned her flight. His tone had been neutral, not distracted, not concerned, neutral. He hadn't asked which hotel she'd booked. He hadn't told her to text when she landed. The kiss he placed against her cheek had already been moving away before it finished. She had smiled back then, because smiling required less energy than asking a question she already suspected the answer to. Standing here now, she recognized those moments for what they were, not random, rehearsed. Some people don't lie by creating new stories. They lie by growing comfortable inside old ones. Aurelia rested her forehead briefly against the door, not in grief, not in weakness, in acknowledgement. This was the final page of a chapter she had been reading alone. On the other side of the door was proof that her instincts had been ahead of her willingness to act. For those listening, welcome to Midnight Story Vault. These are the stories that surface when the world quiets enough to hear them clearly. If moments like this feel familiar, if you've ever stood at the edge of a truth you were slow to name, you're not alone here. Staying connected simply means you don't have to listen in isolation. Aurelia straightened. She wasn't bracing herself for pain. She had already carried that quietly for months. What remained now was something steadier, self-respect catching up to truth. The music inside shifted slightly, careless and unguarded. Whoever was in that room felt safe. That safety hadn't come from trust. It had come from assumption. Her thoughts drifted briefly, uninvited, through the recent past. Missed dinners explained as exhaustion. Conversations that ended before they began. Silas listening only long enough to respond, not to understand. Absence, she realized, doesn't begin when someone leaves. It begins when they stop being curious. She asked herself the harder question she had avoided for too long. What's worse, being betrayed, or realizing you were being managed into predictability? Inside the room, voices moved closer, then away again. A woman laughed softly. "You're sure?" the woman asked. "You said she'd be gone all weekend."
Always sticks to schedule.
That's convenient.
You learn patterns when you live with someone long enough.
You ever feel bad?
Silas answered without pause. "She is. She always sticks to schedule." The sentence landed cleanly. Aurelia didn't react. She listened. "That's convenient," the woman said. Silas chuckled. You learn patterns when you live with someone long enough. Patterns, not partnership. Patterns. You ever feel bad? The woman asked, curiosity replacing caution. There was a brief pause. About what? Silas replied. About lying. Another pause, longer this time. I'm not lying, he said. I just don't share everything. That's still lying, the woman said lightly. Only if you think she needs to know. That was when Aurelia understood the true shape of it. This wasn't confusion or temptation. It was dismissal. He hadn't crossed a boundary recklessly. He had stepped over it calmly, trusting it would never be enforced. There is a difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who assumes immunity. One worries about consequences, the other plans around them. What happens if she finds out? The woman asked. Silas didn't hesitate. She won't. Certainty has a sound, so does entitlement. Aurelia placed her shoes carefully on the floor beside her. Not hesitation, preparation. She wanted to feel the ground beneath her feet when the next moment arrived. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about alignment, bringing what she knew into agreement with what she would no longer tolerate. Accountability, she understood now, is not cruelty. Boundaries are not punishment. They are the structure that allows trust to exist without fear. Inside, laughter returned, light and assured. Aurelia reached for the handle, not to catch him, not to shame him, but to end the agreement he believed still stood. The door began to open. Before there were schedules that replaced conversations, before affection began to sound like courtesy, Aurelia remembered Silas as someone who chose her deliberately. The memory returned without effort, folding neatly into the moment outside the bedroom door. It came from years earlier, when they were still learning each other without the pressure of expectation. Silas had been attentive then, not loudly, not performatively, but with a steadiness that made her feel considered. He listened with his body as much as his words, leaning in when she spoke, finishing her thoughts only when invited. When he smiled at her across crowded rooms, it wasn't ownership she felt, but recognition. You always notice details other people miss, he had told her once, squeezing her hand as they left a charity dinner. That's why I trust you. At the time, she had believed him completely. They had built their life with intention, not rushed, not careless. Meetings over coffee that turned into late dinners, long walks where ideas flowed more easily than promises. When he proposed, it wasn't extravagant. It was quiet, certain. He had said her name like a decision already made. Their early marriage carried that same energy. Shared calendars that felt collaborative rather than restrictive. Arguments that ended in understanding, not silence. Silas asked for her input before making major decisions, especially where his company intersected with her philanthropic work. He treated her perspective as additive, not decorative. At public events, he introduced her with pride. This is Aurelia, he would say, one hand at the small of her back. She's the reason half of what I do actually works. She would correct him gently. We do it together. And he would smile, indulgent but sincere. Exactly. Those moments mattered because they formed the standard she would later measure everything against. Love, she had learned, isn't only how someone treats you when it's easy. It's how often they invite you into the parts of their life that don't require witnesses. Looking back now, Aurelia could admit that what hurt most wasn't that things changed. It was that they changed so gradually she had been adjusting without realizing she was the only one doing so. At the time, though, standing inside those memories, she still believed partnership meant growth in the same direction. She hadn't yet learned how subtle distance could feel like maturity, until one day it didn't. As their marriage settled into rhythm, Aurelia noticed how often their names began to appear together before they entered a room. Invitations arrived addressed to both of them as a single unit. Panels, galas, foundation dinners, always framed as a partnership that worked because it looked effortless. On stage, Silas spoke with confidence about innovation and responsibility. Aurelia followed with measured clarity, grounding vision in impact. Their roles complemented each other cleanly. When applause came, it often came as one wave, not divided. You two make it look easy, a donor once remarked, lifting a glass toward them. Silas smiled first. That's because it is, Aurelia added gently. It's work, but it's shared. He squeezed her hand then, a gesture practiced enough to appear natural, still warm enough to feel sincere. At home, the pace changed, but the tone remained aligned, at least on the surface. They debriefed events over late dinners. Aurelia remembered Silas asking, "Did that land the way you expected?" when she spoke on panels. He cared about how things felt, not just how they looked. Or at least, he had. Over time, something subtle shifted. The questions became statements. Decisions were shared after they were already made. Silas still looped her in, but now it sounded like reporting rather than collaboration. "I moved the meeting," he said one evening, loosening his tie. It conflicted with a board call. "Oh," Aurelia replied, "I thought we were reviewing that together." "We'll catch up later," he said easily. "It's not a big deal." She accepted that answer because it didn't feel like exclusion yet. It felt like efficiency. Publicly, the image sharpened. Articles described them as a model couple, a blend of wealth and purpose. At events, people approached Aurelia not just as Silas's wife, but as his stabilizing force. "You keep him grounded," someone once told her. She smiled politely. "We balance each other." What no one saw was how often balance quietly turns into compensation. Aurelia began carrying emotional weight without naming it. She smoothed conversations. She anticipated moods. She filled in gaps so the image remained seamless. There's a lesson buried in moments like these. When perception becomes more important than presence, relationships don't collapse. They harden. They hold shape long after they stop holding warmth. Aurelia didn't feel unloved yet. She felt useful. And usefulness, she would later understand, is a dangerous substitute for intimacy. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived in small exchanges that felt reasonable on their own. Silas began coming home later, not unpredictably, but consistently enough to form a pattern. When Aurelia asked about his day, his answers grew efficient, informative, complete in the way reports are complete. It was productive, he'd say, loosening his cufflinks. "We're closing a few things next week." She learned not to follow with too many questions. He seemed tired, and she told herself that ambition often demanded uneven seasons. Instead, she adapted. She timed dinners later. She kept meals warm. She learned which evenings he preferred silence over conversation. One night, as she cleared the table, she said, "We haven't talked properly in a while." Silas looked up, surprised. "We talk all the time." "We exchange updates," she replied calmly. "That's not the same thing." He studied her for a moment, then reached across the table and touched her hand. "You know I appreciate you, right?" Appreciation, not closeness, not curiosity. She nodded, because challenging that distinction felt like creating a problem where none officially existed. Aurelia compensated without naming it as such. She took on more logistical planning so he wouldn't have to think about it. She managed schedules, coordinated staff, adjusted foundation timelines around his availability. Emotionally, she softened her needs, framing them as flexible rather than essential. When friends asked how marriage was treating her, she answered honestly, but selectively. "We're busy," she'd say, "but we're good." And she believed it, because nothing had broken. Nothing had ended. Yet, Silas, meanwhile, grew more accustomed to the space she created. Affection became efficient. A kiss before bed. A hand on her shoulder in passing. Gestures that acknowledged presence without engaging with it. "You don't mind if I take this call?" he asked one evening, phone already in hand. "No," she replied, stepping aside. "Go ahead." She watched him walk away, noticing how easily he assumed her consent. There's an unspoken education in moments like these. When one partner consistently absorbs the cost of imbalance, the other begins to expect it, not out of malice, but out of comfort. Over time, effort shifts direction, and silence becomes the price of peace. Aurelia didn't feel neglected yet. She felt necessary. And necessity can feel flattering, until you realize it doesn't require presence, only availability. She would later understand that this was the exchange being made quietly, her adaptability for his certainty. At the time, she was still trying to keep the connection intact. The foundation grew faster than either of them had expected. What began as a focused initiative soon expanded into multiple programs, each requiring layers of coordination, oversight, and public accountability. Aurelia thrived in that space. Structure suited her. She understood systems, people, and timing. More importantly, she understood restraint. Silas trusted her with the direction, even as he remained the face. "You handle the details better than anyone," he told her one morning, scanning emails while she outlined a new outreach plan. "Just loop me in when it's ready." That was how Briar entered their orbit. "She came, highly recommended," Silas said, glancing up from his phone. "Sharp, efficient, ambitious," Aurelia nodded. "I'll meet her." Their first meeting was brief and professional. Briar spoke quickly, eager but controlled, her eyes flicking between Aurelia and the materials on the table. "I admire what you've built," Briar said. "The structure, I mean. It's thoughtful. Thoughtful keeps things sustainable," Aurelia replied evenly. "We value consistency here." Briar smiled. "Of course." At first, nothing felt off. Briar did her work well. She anticipated needs. She stayed late without being asked. Silas mentioned her name more often, usually in passing. "Briar flagged something in the budget," he said one evening. "That's good," Aurelia replied. "I asked her to watch for gaps." Still, Aurelia noticed small shifts. Silas began copying Briar on messages he used to send directly to Aurelia. Meetings that once involved the two of them now included a third presence. One afternoon, Aurelia walked into the conference room earlier than planned. Silas and Briar were already there. "Oh," Silas said, looking up. "We were just reviewing notes." Aurelia glanced at the screen. "Without me?" Briar stepped back slightly. "I can step out if—" "No," Silas said quickly. "It's fine. We were just aligning." Aligning. The word settled quietly. Later that night, Aurelia mentioned it. "You don't usually start foundation meetings without me." Silas shrugged. "It wasn't a big discussion. She's just proactive." "I hired her to support the work," Aurelia said, "not replace communication." He sighed, not sharply, but with impatience. "You're reading into it." She let it go, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the tone. This wasn't denial. It was dismissal. There's an important lesson hidden here. Boundaries often blur not through dramatic oversteps, but through repeated minimization. When concerns are framed as overreaction, intuition learns to speak more quietly. Aurelia didn't accuse. She observed. And observation, she would later realize, is where clarity begins. Aurelia had always trusted restraint more than reaction. It wasn't silence born of fear. It was control shaped by experience. She believed that clarity arrived faster when emotion was given room to settle. So, when the discomfort began to repeat itself, she didn't confront it head-on. She studied it. She noticed how Silas's tone changed when the foundation came up. How he grew precise, almost formal, when Aurelia asked questions that once felt natural between them. "You don't need to worry about that," he said one evening, scrolling through his phone as she spoke. "I'm not worried," she replied. "I'm involved." He looked up then, just briefly. "I know. I just don't want you carrying everything." She almost smiled at the irony. Instead of arguing, she adjusted. She began documenting decisions more carefully. She paid closer attention to who was included in conversations and who wasn't. She trusted her instincts without acting on them immediately, because instinct, she believed, was most useful when paired with patience. Briar remained efficient, polite, always careful to acknowledge Aurelia's authority, yet increasingly familiar with Silas's rhythms. Aurelia noticed how Briar deferred in public but lingered in private conversations. One afternoon, Aurelia said casually, "You seem comfortable working late." Briar smiled. "I like being useful." The word echoed. That night, Aurelia mentioned it to Silas. "She's becoming central to a lot of things." She's doing her job, he replied. Isn't that what you wanted? I wanted support, Aurelia said evenly. Not substitution. Silas exhaled, the sound measured. You're overthinking this. Aurelia let the conversation end there, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the pattern forming. When intelligence meets dismissal, it often chooses observation over escalation, not out of weakness, but strategy. She had learned long ago that emotional restraint is often mistaken for obliviousness. People assume that if you're not reacting, you're not noticing. In reality, restraint is frequently the stage before decisive clarity. Aurelia wasn't afraid of what she might find. She was preparing herself to respond without doubt when the time came. She understood something many people overlook. Acting too early can cloud judgment, but waiting too long can cost self-respect. The balance is knowing when patience stops being wisdom and starts being permission. As she moved through her days, Aurelia began quietly reclaiming her awareness. Not to accuse, not to control, but to ensure that when she finally spoke, she would do so without second-guessing herself. That moment, she sensed, was approaching. The night before Aurelia's trip arrived without ceremony. No argument preceded it. No tension announced itself openly. That was what made it unsettling in retrospect, the normalcy of it all. The kitchen lights were low, casting a soft glow over the marble counter as Aurelia zipped her carry-on. Silas stood across from her, leaning back against the island, phone face down for once. He watched her pack with the kind of attention that looked present but felt detached. 3 days, she said lightly, more to test the air than to inform him. I'll be back before you even miss me. Silas smiled. It reached his mouth, not his eyes. Yeah. 3 days. She paused, fingers stilling on the zipper. I'll text when I land. He nodded. No rush. No rush. In the past, he would have reminded her anyway. Sent a message halfway through her flight, asking if she'd eaten. Asked which hotel she chose, whether the room was quiet enough for her to rest. Tonight, he remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, already elsewhere in posture if not in body. You'll be okay here? She asked, keeping her tone neutral. Silas chuckled softly. I think I can manage my own house. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Aurelia smiled in response, though she felt the subtle shift beneath it. She walked toward him, stopping close enough to feel familiar, but not close enough to interrupt his space. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. It was brief, polite, over before it fully landed. Try not to burn the place down while I'm gone, she joked, the line delivered gently, an offering of ease. I'll survive, he replied. She waited a moment, half expecting him to follow her toward the door, to ask something, anything, that acknowledged absence. He didn't. Instead, he picked up his phone again, glancing at the screen as if remembering something that required attention. Aurelia reached for her bag. I'll see you soon. Safe travels, he said. That was all. As she stepped out into the hallway, she felt it then. Not suspicion, not fear, but a quiet finality. The sense that something essential had already shifted, and neither of them was naming it aloud. This is often how endings begin, not with conflict, but with indifference disguised as calm. When emotional distance replaces curiosity, it becomes easy to confuse peace with connection. Aurelia walked to the elevator without looking back. By the time the doors closed, she understood something with surprising clarity. The goodbye had not been careless. It had been practiced, and it told her everything she needed to know. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Aurelia stood facing the mirrored wall, carry-on beside her, watching her own reflection without really seeing it. The doors opened to the quiet hush of the lobby, polished floors, and soft greetings that barely registered. Good evening, Mrs. Cade, the concierge said warmly. Good evening, she replied, her voice steady enough to convince even herself. Outside, the night air met her skin, cooler than expected. The city moved the way it always did, cars passing, lights changing, people continuing on paths that didn't pause for anyone's private reckoning. She stepped toward the waiting car, placed her bag inside, and slid into the back seat. To the airport? The driver asked, already reaching for the gear. Aurelia looked out the window, watching her building rise behind her in glass and steel. For a moment, she said nothing. Her body felt alert in a way that had nothing to do with travel. Not tense. Awake. Yes, she said finally. Then, after a brief pause that...
To the airport?
Yes, actually, circle the block first.
Of course.
Then, after a brief pause that surprised even her, actually, circle the block first. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Of course. As the car pulled away, Aurelia rested her head lightly against the seat. She told herself she was only buying time, a moment to breathe, a moment to let the feelings settle. Yet, beneath that explanation was something quieter and more honest. She wasn't running from anything. She was listening. Sometimes instinct doesn't shout. It waits until movement creates enough space for truth to surface. The car moved smoothly, tracing the perimeter of streets Aurelia knew by heart. She watched familiar storefronts slide past, their lights steady, indifferent. Nothing outside had changed. Something inside had. She expected her mind to race, to invent reasons for the unease tightening her chest. Instead, it grew quieter, focused. Her thoughts lined up the way they did when a difficult decision had already been made, even if she hadn't yet admitted it out loud. "You're not in a hurry?" the driver asked gently, adjusting speed with traffic. "No," Aurelia said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." He nodded, accepting the answer without curiosity. The car continued on. She understood then that this wasn't hesitation. Hesitation feels noisy. This felt clean. The choice to delay wasn't about fear of leaving or fear of staying. It was about refusing to rush past a truth that had finally made itself known. People often mistake instinct for impulse, but they are not the same. Impulse demands action immediately. Instinct asks for alignment first. It gathers information quietly, then waits for consent. Aurelia glanced at her phone. No messages. No missed calls. That absence mattered more than she expected. She didn't feel dramatic. She felt awake. And once awareness arrives, pretending not to see it becomes its own decision. The hotel lobby was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Soft voices, measured footsteps, the kind of calm designed for people passing through rather than settling in. Aurelia approached the front desk, placing her bag at her feet. "Good evening," the clerk said, offering a practiced smile. "Checking in?" "Yes," Aurelia replied. "One night." "Name?" She gave one that wasn't hers. The clerk typed, nodded, and slid a keycard across the counter. "Elevators to your left. Thank you." The room was small but orderly, neutral colors, clean lines, nothing personal. Aurelia set her bag down and stood still for a moment, listening to the silence. No shared space to manage, no one else's rhythm to anticipate, just her breath, steady and unobserved. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the feelings surface. Not anger, not sadness, doubt, stored in the body long before the mind admits it. The tightness she'd ignored during dinners. The pauses she'd filled too quickly. The instinct to adjust before asking why adjustment was necessary. Here, alone, those signals felt clearer. Without distraction, they formed a pattern she could no longer dismiss. There's a quiet education in solitude. When external noise falls away, the body often tells the truth first. It remembers what the mind has negotiated away in the name of peace. Aurelia lay back, staring at the ceiling, and understood something gently but firmly. This pause wasn't avoidance. It was preparation. Lying there, Aurelia let her thoughts move without direction. She didn't chase them. She allowed them to surface in their own order. Moments she had once brushed aside returned with sharper edges. Silas standing near the window, phone angled away. "Who was that?" she had asked lightly. "Work," he'd replied, already turning back to the screen. The time he cancelled dinner and said, "You understand, right?" before she could answer. The way he used certainty as a shortcut, closing conversations before they could open. She remembered a fundraiser where Briar had leaned in a little too close while Silas spoke, their heads tilted toward each other, as if sharing context Aurelia hadn't been offered. At the time, she had dismissed the feeling as fatigue. Now, those moments rearranged themselves, not to accuse but to clarify. There's an important lesson here. When doubt appears repeatedly, it's rarely because something is unclear. It's often because clarity threatens the comfort of what you've already invested. Denial doesn't always look like refusal. Sometimes, it looks like politeness, patience, the choice to stay agreeable. Aurelia sat up slowly. She wasn't angry at her past self. She understood her. She had wanted the story to remain intact. But intuition doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. If you're listening and you've ever questioned whether you were being intuitive or just cautious, ask yourself this: how many times did the same feeling return, unchanged, despite your best explanations? Aurelia already knew her answer. Aurelia sat at the edge of the bed and checked the time. It was late enough that returning would be inconvenient, early enough that leaving again would still make sense. That narrow window mattered. She stood, crossed to the bathroom mirror, and studied her reflection, not for reassurance, for honesty. The face looking back at her wasn't afraid. It was resolved. Her phone buzzed. A message from Silas, brief and casual. "Did you land okay?" She stared at the screen. The timing was precise, too precise. He hadn't asked earlier. He hadn't checked in before. This message wasn't concern, it was maintenance. Aurelia typed nothing. She set the phone down. This was the pivot she hadn't named until now. Not a move toward confrontation, but away from denial. She wasn't trying to catch anyone. She was choosing not to be managed by half-truths and convenient timing. If you're listening, this is often where the real decision lives, between trusting your internal signals and protecting the comfort of what you've already built. One preserves certainty. The other preserves self-respect. If you've stood here before, you know which choice costs more in the long run. Aurelia picked up her bag. The plan had changed, not in anger, but in alignment. She would go back, not to accuse, to know. The lobby was quieter when Aurelia returned, as if the building itself had decided to keep her confidence. She handed the keycard back at the desk without explanation. "Checking out already?" The clerk asked. "Yes," Aurelia replied. Plans changed. Outside, the car was waiting where she'd left it. The driver opened the door, glanced at her bag, then met her eyes in the mirror. "Airport now."
Airport now?
No. Take me home.
"Airport now?" he asked. "No," she said. "Take me home." He didn't question it. The engine turned over smoothly, and the city folded back around them. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one briefly illuminating the interior before releasing it again. Aurelia sat still, hands folded in her lap, breathing even. There was no urgency in her body now, only direction. Silence filled the car, but it wasn't empty. It held resolve, the kind that comes when you stop negotiating with yourself. She thought about how often people confuse peace with comfort, how easy it is to keep moving forward, simply because stopping would require a decision. Tonight, she had stopped long enough to choose honesty over convenience. The car turned onto her street. The building came into view, familiar and changed all at once. Aurelia didn't rehearse what she would say. She didn't prepare for confrontation. She had already done the important work, deciding that whatever waited inside would be met without self-betrayal. When the car slowed to a stop, she nodded once. "Thank you," she said. The door closed behind her, and with it, the last excuse she had been carrying. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, just as it always had. Aurelia stepped out into the quiet, the doors sliding shut behind her with a muted finality. The lights were dimmer than usual, set low in a way that suggested intention rather than neglect. Not forgotten, arranged. She slipped off her heels and held them in one hand. The marble beneath her feet felt cool, faintly polished, familiar enough to ground her. The air carried a subtle mix of scents she recognized and one she didn't. Her own home, slightly altered. Claimed, but not by her. Music played somewhere ahead, not loud, not hidden. A steady rhythm that filled space without asking permission. She paused, listening, not to confirm anything but to orient herself. Sound has a way of revealing comfort. Whoever chose that music hadn't been concerned about interruption. Aurelia set her bag down near the entry console. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She reached out and brushed her fingers lightly against the wall as she passed, the texture smooth, uninterrupted. Every detail registered sharply now, the soft glow from recessed lighting, the faint hum of the climate system, the way the apartment felt occupied without feeling alive. "Silas," she called, not loudly, not sharply, no answer. She exhaled slowly and began walking. The hallway stretched longer than usual, or perhaps she was simply more aware of each step. The sound of her bare feet against the floor felt louder, in contrast to the music ahead. Her pulse remained steady. This wasn't adrenaline, it was focus. As she passed the study, she noticed the door ajar. Papers on the desk, a jacket draped over the chair that wasn't hers. She didn't stop to look closer. Curiosity had already served its purpose. At the end of the hallway, the bedroom door stood partially closed. Light spilled through the opening, warmer than the rest of the apartment. The music came from there, unmistakably. Aurelia stopped a few feet away. This was the threshold she'd already crossed internally. Everything beyond it would simply confirm what had been decided earlier in silence. She rested one hand against the doorframe, steadying herself, not because she felt weak, but because she respected the moment. There's an education in how people enter truths they can no longer avoid. Some rush, some freeze, others arrive quietly, knowing that clarity doesn't require force to be real. Aurelia pushed the door open. The door opened fully, and Aurelia stepped into the bedroom without announcement. The lighting was low, warm in tone, deliberately chosen. Its softened edges made everything appear calmer than it had any right to be. The curtains were partially drawn, city lights filtering in through the glass in muted lines. The bed was rumpled, not carelessly but recently. For a brief moment, no one noticed her. Silas stood near the edge of the bed, his back turned, hands mid-motion as he reached for a shirt. He was speaking, his voice casual, unguarded. "I told you. She won't be back until—" He stopped. The shift was immediate. His shoulders tightened before he turned, as if his body recognized the presence before his mind caught up. When he faced her, the color drained from his expression in stages, disbelief giving way to calculation. "Aurelia," he said too quickly. You're supposed to be—" She didn't answer. Her gaze moved past him, calm and precise, landing on the woman sitting on the bed. Briar, wrapped in the sheet, hair loose, eyes wide not with fear, but with the shock of miscalculation. Recognition passed through Aurelia quietly, not surprise, not disbelief. Context. Silas took a step forward. "This isn't what it looks like." Aurelia held up one hand, not abruptly, gently. The room obeyed the gesture. "Don't," she said. Her voice was even. "You don't need to explain anything to me." Briar swallowed. I didn't know she'd be back," she said, her voice unsteady. Aurelia looked at her then, not with anger, with assessment. "You knew I existed." Silence settled, thick but contained. Silas ran a hand through his hair, breath uneven. "Listen, we can talk about this. Privately." "We are talking," Aurelia replied. "You're just not directing it." She took another step into the room, stopping just short of the bed. Her calm did something panic never could. It removed his footing. He searched her face for emotion he could respond to and found none that invited negotiation. This is often where people misunderstand strength. They expect volume, tears, collapse. But composure, when paired with certainty, leaves no room for manipulation. It shifts the balance instantly. Aurelia wasn't here to accuse. She was here to conclude, and everyone in the room felt it. Silas moved again, this time faster, as if motion itself might restore control. He reached for Aurelia's arm and stopped short when she didn't flinch, when she didn't even look at his hand. "Aurelia, please," he said, breath shallow now. "This isn't how it looks." "I can explain." "You already have," she replied. Her tone remained level, almost instructional. "You just didn't realize you were doing it out loud." Briar shifted on the bed, clutching the sheet higher, eyes darting between them. "He told me you were separated," she said quickly, words tumbling over each other. "He said you were barely speaking, that you'd agreed to see other people." Aurelia turned to her fully then. The movement was unhurried. "He told you that," she repeated, not as a question, but as a clarification. Silas cut in. "I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to simplify." "Simplify," Aurelia echoed. "By removing me from the truth." His voice rose despite himself. "I felt invisible, Aurelia. You were always busy, always managing everything. I didn't think you even noticed anymore." She regarded him steadily. "You mistook my steadiness for absence." That was when panic settled in properly. His breathing became uneven. His words lost structure. "We can fix this," he said. "We don't have to make it bigger than it is." Aurelia shook her head once. "Small. Final. This is exactly as big as it needs to be." She reached into her bag and took out her phone. Silas noticed and froze. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice sharp with fear. "I'm documenting reality," she said, "so no one has to rewrite it later." Briar's eyes filled. "Are you calling someone?" "Yes," Aurelia replied, "because clarity matters." Silas stepped back, hands raised now. "There's no need for that. We can handle this ourselves." "That assumption," Aurelia said quietly, "is part of the problem. There's an important lesson in moments like this. When accountability arrives, those who relied on privacy often call it excessive. But boundaries aren't escalations. They're corrections, and correction doesn't require anger to be effective." Aurelia unlocked her phone. Aurelia didn't rush the moment. She stood where she was, phone resting in her hand, eyes steady as they returned to Briar. The recognition was quiet, almost clinical. Not shock, not disbelief. Context settling into place. "Briar," Aurelia said, using her name as if this were a scheduled meeting rather than a collision. "You work for the Foundation." Briar nodded quickly. "Yes. I never meant for this to—" "You didn't stumble into this," Aurelia replied. Her voice remained even, careful with words. "You accepted information that made this feel acceptable." Silas interjected, desperation sharpening his tone. "Don't do this. Don't turn this into something it isn't." Aurelia glanced at him briefly. "I'm not turning anything. I'm naming it." Briar's shoulders folded inward. "He said you were aware, that you had an understanding." Aurelia held her gaze. "Did you ever hear that from me?" Silence answered. That was enough. Aurelia understood then that this wasn't about a rival or replacement. It was about access, about how proximity to power can blur ethics when ambition is given permission. Briar hadn't been reckless. She had been strategic, trusting that distance between spouses meant space for interpretation. This is where clarity does its work. When facts are spoken plainly, excuses lose oxygen. No raised voice is needed, no spectacle, just alignment between what happened and what it means. Silas tried again, softer now. "You're overreacting. People make mistakes." Aurelia shook her head. "Mistakes involve error. This involved planning." She turned back to Briar. "You knew where you were," she said. "You knew whose home this was. You chose to stay." Briar's eyes dropped. "I didn't think—" "That's the risk of borrowing someone else's certainty," Aurelia said. "You inherit their consequences too." There was no cruelty in her tone, only accuracy. Aurelia lifted her phone again, thumb hovering. She wasn't angry enough to tremble. She wasn't hurt enough to plead. She was precise enough to proceed. Education lives here, often overlooked. When accountability is applied calmly, it exposes intent without argument. It shows that control doesn't come from volume, but from refusing to negotiate reality. Aurelia pressed the screen. Aurelia brought the phone to her ear and waited for the connection. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing remained even. The room, however, felt smaller, not because she raised her voice, but because she removed uncertainty. Silas stared at the phone as if it were a weapon. "Aurelia," he said carefully now, lowering his tone. "This doesn't need to involve anyone else." "It already does," she replied, eyes forward. "You just assumed it wouldn't." The call connected. "Emergency services," a calm voice answered. "Yes," Aurelia said. "I need officers dispatched to my residence. There's a domestic incident I want formally documented." Silas stepped back, palms open. "Domestic incident?" He let out a strained laugh. "That makes it sound—" "It sounds accurate," Aurelia said, still addressing the call. "No one is injured. I'm safe. I'm requesting documentation." The operator asked for the address. Aurelia gave it without hesitation. Briar's breath caught. "Are we in trouble?" Aurelia looked at her briefly. "That depends on whether you confuse discomfort with consequence." Silas shook his head. "You're doing this to punish me." Aurelia ended the call and lowered the phone. "No, I'm doing this to protect the truth. There's a difference many people miss. Rage seeks relief. Precision seeks record." Aurelia wasn't interested in creating a scene. She was preventing revision. When situations remain private, narratives tend to bend toward whoever speaks loudest later. Documentation closes that gap. Silas's voice dropped. "Think about what this will do. To us." "I have," Aurelia said. "I'm thinking about what happens if I don't." She moved to the window and opened it slightly, letting in night air. The city continued below, indifferent and steady. She turned back to the room. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "Both of you." Silas hesitated, then complied. Briar followed. Aurelia stood near the doorway, not looming, not retreating. She had positioned herself where she could leave easily if needed. That detail mattered. Safety isn't about fear, it's about foresight. For anyone listening, this is the lesson most stories skip. Calm action is not escalation. It's boundary setting made visible. When you choose clarity over chaos, you reduce risk for everyone involved, even those who resent the exposure. Aurelia checked the time. The response would be quick. Some consequences don't arrive with shouting. They arrive with sirens you didn't think would ever be pointed your way. At first, the sound was distant enough to be mistaken for traffic, a faint rise and fall that blended into the city's usual rhythm. Aurelia noticed it before either of them did, not because she was listening for it, but because she was no longer avoiding anything. Silas heard it next. His posture changed instantly. He stood, then sat again, unable to decide which position offered less exposure. Briar's eyes lifted toward the window, then dropped to the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the sheet as if it were the only solid thing left. "That's not necessary," Silas said, voice tight. "You've made your point." Aurelia didn't respond. She stood near the doorway, phone in hand, gaze steady. The sound grew clearer now, unmistakable in its cadence. Approaching. Intentional. "What do we say?" Briar asked quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. "You say the truth," Aurelia replied. "It's the simplest version." Silas let out a breath that sounded like frustration edged with disbelief. "You really didn't have to do this." "I did," Aurelia said calmly. "Because what happens next shouldn't depend on who controls the story." That was the final shift. Not when the door opened, not when uniforms would step inside, but here, in the moment when Silas understood that privacy was no longer his. Shield. He looked at Aurelia, as if seeing her fully for the first time, not as a partner to negotiate with, but as someone who would not absorb the cost of his certainty anymore. The sound outside rose, then paused. Briar wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I didn't think it would end like this." Aurelia met her eyes briefly. "It didn't end," she said. "It clarified. There's a quiet education in that distinction. Endings feel dramatic. Clarification feels firm. One closes a chapter. The other explains why it had to be closed. The knock came, controlled and professional. Aurelia moved first. not rushed, not hesitant. She reached the door and opened it fully, standing aside rather than stepping back. "Good evening," she said evenly. "Thank you for coming." Behind her, the room was still. The music had stopped at some point without anyone noticing. Silence filled the space now, not empty, but settled, like something that had finally found its place. As the officers entered, Aurelia felt no triumph, no relief, only alignment. What she knew matched what was happening. There would be no revision later. No questions about what had occurred or who had seen it. Outside, the lights continued to flash softly against the glass. Inside, Aurelia stood grounded, knowing that clarity, once chosen, does not ask to be undone. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, their presence changing the air without raising its volume. One remained near the entrance, posture neutral, while the other stepped forward, notebook already in hand. There were no raised voices, no urgency that fed on spectacle. Just procedure. "Ma'am," the officer said to Aurelia, "can you tell us what happened tonight?" Aurelia nodded once. "Yes. I returned to my residence earlier than planned and found my husband with another individual in our shared bedroom. I'm requesting that this be formally documented." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't editorialize. She stated facts the way she handled Foundation reports, clearly without excess. Silas shifted behind her. "This doesn't need to be written up like this," he said quickly. "We had a misunderstanding." The officer looked at him briefly. "Sir, you'll have a chance to speak." Aurelia continued. "No one is injured. I'm safe. I'm not requesting removal at this time. I want a record." The word record landed with weight. Silas opened his mouth again, then closed it, frustration tightening his jaw. Briar sat rigidly at the edge of the bed, blanket pulled around her shoulders. When the officer addressed her, she answered carefully, offering a version that softened timelines and blurred intent. "I was told they were separated," she said. That this was understood. The officer wrote without reacting. Aurelia listened without interruption. When the officer looked back to her, she said simply, "That statement is inaccurate." Silas turned. "Aurelia, please don't speak for me," she said calmly. "I haven't spoken for you." The exchange shifted the room, not through conflict, but through clarity. Everyone understood now that this would not be managed through charm or explanation. It would be preserved as it happened. There's a lesson in this moment that rarely gets told honestly. When people choose documentation over argument, they protect themselves from later revision. Memory fades. Accounts change. Paper doesn't. The officers asked follow-up questions. Aurelia answered each one fully, without embellishment. When it was done, the notebook closed. "Thank you," the officer said. "If you need anything further, contact information is here." Aurelia accepted the card. "I appreciate your professionalism." As the officers prepared to leave, Silas exhaled sharply. "You didn't have to make it official." "I did," Aurelia replied, "because unofficial stories rarely end in truth." The door closed behind them. Silence returned, not empty, but controlled. And for the first time that night, Aurelia felt the balance shift back into her hands. The door had barely closed before Silas started pacing. The space he usually commanded felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted in response to the record that had just been made. "You didn't need to say it like that," he said, running a hand through his hair. "You made it sound calculated." Aurelia turned slightly, leaning back against the console table. "I described what happened. You framed it," he insisted. "There's a difference." She studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with curiosity. Only when someone is trying to escape the frame, Silas stopped pacing. "This didn't have to become a narrative," he said. "We could have kept it contained." "Contained for whom?" Aurelia asked. "For us," he replied quickly. "For the family, the company, the foundation." "The truth isn't a threat to those things," Aurelia said evenly, "only to the version of them that depends on omission." He scoffed. "You're acting like this was intentional." "It was," she replied, "not to hurt me, to avoid accountability." Silas's voice softened, shifting tactics. You know how these things look once they leave the room. People will assume the worst. People already do, Aurelia said. That's why documentation matters. Briar remained silent, eyes lowered. When Silas glanced at her, she stiffened, as if waiting for instruction that never came. Silas turned back to Aurelia. You could have protected me. Aurelia straightened. I protected myself. That distinction landed hard. There's an education here that often gets buried beneath emotion. When someone tries to rewrite events immediately after they're recorded, it's rarely about clarification. It's about control. The impulse to reshape truth appears strongest when power has just shifted. Silas exhaled, frustrated. So what now? You let them walk out and think this is done? No, Aurelia said. Now I stop explaining. She picked up her phone, not to text, not to call, simply to have it in her hand. Silas noticed and went quiet. Anything you say next, she continued, assumes I owe you interpretation. I don't. He stared at her, the realization settling slowly. The story he had rehearsed no longer had an audience. Silence followed, uncomfortable and instructive. For once, Aurelia did not fill it, and in that quiet, it became clear whose version would stand. Briar spoke only after Silas fell quiet, as if the absence of his voice created a vacuum she felt compelled to fill. I never meant for this to go this far, she said, eyes fixed on the floor. I was told things were complicated, that you were both focused on work. Aurelia didn't interrupt. She waited, allowing the explanation to take its full shape. Silas shifted. I said we were distant, he added quickly. That's not the same as lying. Aurelia turned toward Briar. Did he ever say I agreed to any of this? Briar hesitated. He said, you understood the situation. Did you hear that from me? Aurelia asked again. No, Briar admitted. The room settled around that answer. Briar's shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally landed. I thought proximity meant permission. I was working closely with him. I assumed. That's the risk of assumption, Aurelia said calmly. It fills gaps with what benefits you most. Silas snapped. This isn't all on her. I'm not assigning percentages, Aurelia replied. I'm clarifying responsibility. Briar looked up then, eyes glossy. I didn't want to be invisible. I wanted to matter. Aurelia met her gaze. Then you should have chosen a path that didn't require someone else's erasure. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Briar looked away, the realization settling in stages. There's a lesson here that doesn't get enough daylight. Ambition isn't the problem. The problem is when ambition borrows certainty from someone else's authority and mistakes access for consent. When that happens, ethics tend to bend quietly until consequences straighten them again. Briar swallowed. What happens now? Aurelia answered without hesitation. Now, the truth exists outside your intentions. Silas opened his mouth, then closed it. The narrative he'd been trying to maintain had lost its structure. Aurelia picked up her bag. I won't argue about motivations, she said. They change too easily. Actions don't. Briar nodded slowly, the meaning clear. This wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure. And exposure, once it happens, doesn't need commentary to do its work. Aurelia moved through the apartment, collecting what she needed with quiet efficiency. Not packing, claiming. Her phone, her keys. A folder from the console that held documents she preferred to keep close. Each movement communicated finality without announcement. Silas watched her, unease sharpening into urgency. You're making this worse than it needs to be, he said. People will take sides. They always do, Aurelia replied. I'm just not campaigning. He followed her toward the kitchen. At least let me explain first. I can get ahead of this. Aurelia stopped and turned to him fully. You don't get ahead of facts, she said. You either meet them or run from them. Briar stood near the doorway, arms folded tight. I never spoke to anyone, she said quickly. I didn't tell anyone anything. You don't need to, Aurelia replied. Silence doesn't prevent exposure, it delays it, Silas scoffed. So now, you're threatening us? Aurelia's expression didn't change. I'm setting expectations. She stepped closer, not invading space, not retreating. I won't correct stories you create. I won't deny what's documented. And I won't soften language to protect choices I didn't make. Silas shook his head. You're being cold. No, she said. I'm being accurate. There's a difference that matters. Coldness seeks distance. Accuracy seeks alignment. When people ask you to soften truth for their comfort, they're often asking you to absorb consequences they'd rather avoid. Briar's voice was small. What if this ruins everything? Aurelia met her gaze. What ruins things is pretending they aren't already compromised. She walked to the door, paused, then added, I'm not going to speak publicly. Not tonight, not tomorrow. I don't need to. Silas frowned. Then why do this at all? Aurelia opened the door. Because restraint isn't silence. It's choosing when words matter. She stepped into the hallway, letting the door close behind her without force. Inside, voices rose briefly, then fell. She didn't listen. For anyone watching situations like this unfold, there's a practical truth worth holding. Control doesn't come from louder statements. It comes from consistency. When your actions match your boundaries, you don't need to defend them. Aurelia walked toward the elevator, posture steady. She wasn't fleeing the narrative. She was refusing to manage it. And that choice would speak far longer than anything she could say. Morning arrived without asking permission. Aurelia woke to the soft vibration of her phone on the bedside table. Not a call. Several notifications arriving too close together to be coincidence. She didn't reach for it immediately. She knew the pattern well enough to name it before seeing it. When silence breaks all at once, it's rarely gentle. By the time she unlocked the screen, the first headline was already circulating. Billionaire CEO questioned after late-night incident, Foundation executive named in internal inquiry. She read without flinching. The language was careful, sourced, restrained. Documentation does that. It limits imagination. It anchors speculation to what can be verified. Her phone rang. Silas's name filled the screen. She let it ring. A message followed almost instantly. We need to get in front of this. They're already twisting it. Aurelia set the phone face down. At the cafe downstairs, conversations carried easily. She overheard her own name once, spoken softly, followed by speculation that didn't quite land because no one had enough information to embellish convincingly. At a nearby table, two women spoke in low voices. I thought they were solid, one said. No one is, the other replied. Not like that. Aurelia stirred her coffee and kept her gaze steady. What people said mattered less than what she had chosen not to say. By mid-morning, statements began to appear, carefully worded, vague, phrases like personal matter and ongoing review. Silas's voice filtered through them without ever appearing directly. Another message came through. Just deny it, or at least say it's exaggerated. Aurelia typed a single response, then paused. She deleted it without sending. There's a lesson here worth sitting with. When facts exist independently of you, silence is not weakness. It's strategy. Speaking too early often serves panic more than truth. If you're listening and you've ever felt pressured to explain yourself before you're ready, notice who benefits from your urgency. Reflection is not avoidance. It's discernment. Aurelia paid her bill and stood. Outside, the city moved faster now, hungry for commentary. She gave it none. She walked on, letting the noise do what it always does, talk itself tired. By afternoon, Aurelia's name had fully detached from her presence. It appeared in captions, discussions, opinion pieces written by people who had never met her and never would. Some were sympathetic, others speculative. Most were confident in details they could not verify. She read none of it. Her phone remained on silent as she sat in her office, blinds half drawn, light angled just enough to keep the room calm. Papers lay neatly arranged on her desk. Familiar work, grounding work. She moved through emails unrelated to the incident with steady focus, answering what required answers, leaving the rest untouched. Her assistant knocked lightly. "You have requests coming in. Press. A few board members too." Aurelia nodded. "Tell them I'm unavailable today. Should I schedule something for later?" "Not yet," Aurelia said. "Let the questions finish forming first." That choice mattered. When you respond too early, you end up answering the wrong questions. A text from Silas slipped through, short, strained. "Say something. Please." Aurelia stared at the screen for a moment, then locked the phone and placed it face down. Silence, she knew, was not absence, it was refusal. Refusal to be pulled into reaction. Refusal to let urgency dictate her voice. Outside her office window, a group of reporters gathered near the building entrance. Cameras ready. Conversations overlapping. Waiting for a version of events they could package. They waited a long time. As evening approached, speculation began to lose momentum. Without confirmation, stories flattened. Without commentary, outrage had nowhere to attach itself. The cycle slowed, frustrated by the lack of fuel. There is an education in this restraint that rarely gets taught. When people demand immediate explanation, it's often because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. But clarity doesn't owe speed, it owes accuracy. And sometimes the most powerful response is allowing truth to stand without decoration. Aurelia shut down her computer and gathered her things. As she left the building through a side entrance, no one noticed. No cameras turned. No questions followed. She walked to her car alone. The city settling into evening again, already shifting attention elsewhere. Tomorrow, she knew, conversations would continue. Decisions would follow. Consequences would unfold in their own time. But tonight, Aurelia chose quiet. And while the world kept talking, she kept control. The call came mid-morning, precisely when Aurelia expected it to. She had cleared her schedule without announcing it, leaving space for what required attention rather than reaction. "Good morning, Aurelia," her lawyer said, voice even, familiar. "I assume you've seen the reports." "I have," Aurelia replied. "I want to understand exposure, not commentary." "Then let's start there," he said. Papers shifted on his end. "Based on your prenuptial agreement and the ownership structures we put in place, your position is secure." She listened without interrupting, pen resting idle between her fingers. "The penthouse is held in your name," he continued. 70% of the liquid assets are protected. The foundation accounts are separate and governed independently. His shares are insulated from your personal holdings, not the other way around. Aurelia exhaled once. Not relief, confirmation. "And the company?" she asked. "Your voting rights remain intact," he said. "More importantly, you anticipated scenarios like this. You insisted on clarity when things were calm. That matters now." She remembered those meetings years earlier. Silas had laughed lightly then. Planning for failure, he'd teased. Planning for reality, she had replied. "On the call," the lawyer added, "we can move to freeze joint accounts immediately. It's both symbolic and practical. It prevents narrative decisions from becoming financial ones." "Yes," Aurelia said. "Do it." There was a pause. "All of them." "All of them," she confirmed. When the call ended, Aurelia sat still for a moment. This wasn't escalation, it was execution. The kind that happens when preparation meets circumstance. There's a quiet lesson here. Boundaries drawn early don't signal distrust, they signal self-respect. When clarity is built into agreements, consequences don't need emotion to function. They simply activate. Aurelia ended the call and closed her notebook without writing anything down. She already knew what it contained. Every safeguard had been placed long before this moment demanded them. Years earlier, during the negotiation of the prenuptial agreement, Silas had waved off her concerns with casual confidence. "Do we really need all this?" he'd asked, scanning the document. "It feels excessive." Aurelia had met his gaze then, unflinching. Clarity only feels excessive when things are going well. She hadn't framed it as suspicion. She had framed it as structure, separate accounts, defined ownership. Explicit language around decision-making authority, not because she expected betrayal, but because she understood how power complicates intimacy. Now, that foresight translated into calm action. There was no scramble to recover assets, no late-night calls trying to trace money already moved. The agreements did what they were designed to do. Hold. Her assistant knocked lightly. Finance confirmed the freezes, she said. They'll notify him. Thank you, Aurelia replied. Please document all correspondence. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly. Not from exhaustion, from alignment. This was what intentional planning offered. Not protection from pain, but protection from chaos. People often misunderstand preparation as pessimism. In truth, it's respect for uncertainty. When you prepare during stability, you don't have to negotiate during crisis. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Silas. She didn't answer. A message followed. Did you really freeze everything? Aurelia set the phone down. Preparation doesn't remove feeling. It removes leverage. And when leverage disappears, entitlement tends to reveal itself quickly. She stood and walked to the window, the city stretching below. Consequences had begun their quiet work, indifferent to protest. The confirmation arrived in layers. First, a missed transfer. Then, a declined authorization. By noon, Silas had called 3 times and left 2 messages that grew shorter with each attempt. Aurelia was reviewing a contract when her assistant stepped in quietly. He's at the front desk, she said. He says it's urgent. Aurelia didn't look up right away. Is he scheduled? No. Then it isn't, Aurelia replied. Let him wait. Minutes later, Silas's voice carried faintly from the hallway, frustration bleeding through restraint. There's been a mistake, he insisted to security. My accounts are locked. Aurelia stood and walked to the door herself. When she opened it, Silas turned sharply, relief and anger colliding. You froze everything, he said. I can't access payroll approvals. I can't move money without oversight, Aurelia finished calmly. Correct. This is punitive, he snapped. You're trying to hurt me. She shook her head. I'm preventing improvisation. He lowered his voice. You know I need access. This affects people. It affects patterns, Aurelia replied. That's the point. There's a practical lesson here. Financial boundaries aren't weapons, they're brakes. They slow impulsive decisions that tend to favor whoever moves first. When access is shared, clarity must be shared too, or access must pause. Silas's tone softened. Let's talk privately. We are, Aurelia said. Just not on your terms. Security stepped closer, a quiet reminder of protocol. Silas noticed and fell silent. Aurelia met his eyes. You confused shared resources with entitlement, she said. This pause corrects that. She turned back toward her office. The door closed gently behind her, leaving Silas in the hallway with the first consequence he couldn't talk his way around. Silas returned an hour later, this time with composure he hadn't bothered to practice earlier. His jacket was on. His voice was lower. He had chosen contrition as a strategy. Can we talk? He asked when Aurelia stepped out to meet him. Not as adversaries, as partners. Aurelia didn't sit. She remained standing, hands relaxed at her sides. Say what you came to say. He inhaled slowly. I'm sorry, for everything. I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have told you sooner. That's an apology, she said. Finish the sentence. Silas frowned. Finish what? What you want in exchange for it, Aurelia replied. The pause answered for him. I need temporary access, he said carefully. Just enough to keep things running. You know I wouldn't misuse it. Aurelia nodded once, acknowledging the clarity. So, this is about function, not repair. That's not fair, he said quickly. I'm trying to fix this. You're trying to restore convenience, she said. Fixing something requires changing how you behave when no one is watching. Silas's jaw tightened. You're punishing me. I'm interrupting a pattern, Aurelia corrected. You apologize when access is threatened, you reassure when oversight appears, and you return to habit when pressure lifts. He stared at her, the recognition landing slowly. "You're making this about more than one night." "Because it is," she said evenly. "I'm not responding to an incident. I'm responding to repetition. There's a lesson here that matters beyond this room. Apologies reveal their intent by what they ask for next. When remorse is paired with demands, it isn't remorse. It's negotiation." Aurelia stepped back toward her office. "When your apology stops requesting access, we can talk again." Silas said nothing. He had already said enough. Aurelia didn't raise her voice when she spoke again. She didn't need to. The room was quiet enough now for accuracy to land. "This didn't start with Briar," she said, "and it didn't end in that bedroom." Silas looked up, defensive reflex already forming. "You're rewriting history." "No," Aurelia replied. "I'm finally reading it without editing." She moved to the window, hands resting lightly on the sill. "You withdrew, then waited for me to adjust. You made decisions, then informed me afterward. You blurred boundaries and relied on my patience to absorb the cost. When I noticed, you minimized. When I questioned, you reassured. When I stopped compensating, you called it punishment." Silas shook his head. "That's not how I see it." "I know," she said. "That's the problem." He stepped forward. "You're acting like everything I did was intentional." "Patterns don't require intention to cause damage," Aurelia replied. "They only require permission to continue." Silas's voice dropped. "So what? This is who I am now. This is who you've been when you thought it wouldn't matter," she said calmly. "I'm responding to that version. There's an important truth here that often gets missed. Waiting for a single dramatic moment to justify boundaries keeps people trapped in cycles that never look bad enough until they are. Addressing the pattern prevents the next incident rather than reliving the last one." Aurelia turned back toward him. "I'm not interested in apologies that preserve the same structure. I'm interested in change that survives inconvenience." Silas opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, there was nothing left to reinterpret. Silas stood there a moment longer, as if waiting for Aurelia to soften, to offer a path back into familiarity. When she didn't, he tried once more. "So, that's it?" he asked quietly. "You won't even hear me out." "I have," Aurelia replied. "That's why we're done talking." She stepped back into her office and pressed the call button beneath her desk. Not hurried, not dramatic. The kind of motion made by someone who had already finished deciding. Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers, composed and discreet. "Sir," one of them said to Silas, "we're going to ask you to leave the premises." Silas laughed under his breath, disbelief edging toward humiliation. "You're serious?" "Yes," the officer replied evenly. "We are." Silas turned to Aurelia. "You're really doing this?" Aurelia met his eyes. "I'm allowing protocol to do what emotion shouldn't." He hesitated, then straightened his jacket, pride trying to reassert itself. "This isn't over." "No," Aurelia said calmly. "This is concluded." The officers guided him toward the hallway. No force, no raised voices, just movement, direction, outcome. As he passed the threshold, Silas glanced back once more, searching for something to hold on to. Aurelia had already returned to her desk. The door closed. The hallway fell quiet again. There's a final lesson here that often gets ignored. When consequences are handled through systems rather than arguments, they don't escalate, they settle. Closure doesn't always arrive with emotion. Sometimes it arrives with procedure, and that's enough. Aurelia opened a new file and began the next task, her focus steady. The war had never been loud. It had been precise. The conference room was deliberately small. Glass walls, muted lighting, a table just wide enough to keep people from mistaking proximity for comfort. Aurelia had chosen it for that reason. Briar arrived 2 minutes early and stood instead of sitting, hands clasped in front of her as if posture might soften outcome. When Aurelia entered, she didn't rush. She closed the door behind her and took the seat opposite, placing a slim folder on the table without opening it. "This isn't disciplinary," Briar said quickly, words already prepared. "I just want to explain." Aurelia met her gaze. "You'll have time." "Sit." Briar hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair. The glass reflected both of them, one composed, the other rehearsed. "I didn't intend to cross any lines," Briar began. "I was navigating mixed signals. I thought—" Aurelia raised one finger, not sharply. "This meeting isn't about intention, it's about decision." Silence stretched. The building hummed faintly around them. Briar swallowed. "I never asked for special treatment." "No," Aurelia replied. "You accepted it." That distinction shifted the room. Briar's shoulders tightened, her certainty losing structure. Aurelia leaned back slightly, hands folded. "Before we continue, understand this. I'm not here to debate character or potential. I'm here to conclude access." Briar's eyes flicked to the folder. "Is this already decided?" "Yes," Aurelia said calmly. "That's why this conversation can be honest. There's a quiet education in settings like this. When outcomes are settled, explanations stop performing and start revealing. Power doesn't need volume when authority is clear." Briar nodded slowly, realizing that persuasion had already expired. And for the first time since this began, she wasn't being evaluated. She was being addressed. Briar inhaled as if bracing herself. "I was told the marriage was effectively over," she said. "That you and Silas were aligned professionally but distant personally. I didn't think—" "You didn't verify," Aurelia said, not interrupting, just placing the missing piece where it belonged. Briar's mouth tightened. "I trusted what I was told." "Trust isn't passive," Aurelia replied. "It's a choice you make after checking." Briar leaned forward. "You have to understand the position I was in. I was new, trying to prove myself." Everything moved quickly. Aurelia nodded once. "Pressure explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it." The room felt narrower now, as if the glass walls had edged closer. Briar's justifications began to overlap, repeating themselves in softer variations: misunderstanding, proximity, ambition framed as dedication. "I never tried to replace you," Briar added quickly. "I just responded." Aurelia opened the folder at last, sliding a single page across the table. It wasn't evidence. It was timeline. "Responding still involves choice," Aurelia said. "And choices have direction." Briar stared at the paper. The sequence was clean. Dates, meetings, access points she had accepted without question. "I didn't realize how it looked," Briar murmured. "That's because you were looking forward," Aurelia replied. "Not outward." There's an important lesson here that applies far beyond this room. When justification relies on momentum, on things moving too fast, it often reveals a lack of pause where ethics should live. Speed doesn't remove responsibility, it tests it. Briar sat back, the confidence she'd carried into the room thinning into something closer to recognition. Her story had not collapsed under accusation, it had collapsed under sequence. Briar straightened in her chair, attempting composure she no longer fully owned. "You have to admit," she said carefully, "there was a power difference. He had authority, influence. I didn't feel like I had much room to question." Aurelia regarded her for a long moment. "Power doesn't erase agency," she said. "It clarifies it." Briar's jaw tightened. "That's easy to say when you're the one with leverage." Aurelia leaned forward slightly, closing the distance without raising her voice. "Leverage isn't inherited, it's exercised. You didn't lack power. You used the kind that hides behind proximity." The words landed with precision. Briar shifted, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. For the first time, Aurelia noticed something else. Briar wasn't afraid of consequence. She was afraid of losing access. "You're framing me as calculating," Briar said. "I care about the work." "I believe you," Aurelia replied. "And you still crossed a line." Briar looked up, searching for concession. "So what happens to me?" Aurelia didn't answer immediately. She let the silence do its work, not as punishment, but as clarity. When she spoke, her tone remained even. "What happens," she said, "is that the authority you thought you borrowed no longer applies. There's an education embedded in moments like this. When power shifts, it often reveals what someone valued most. If loss feels like injustice, it's usually because access was mistaken for entitlement." Briar exhaled slowly, shoulders lowering. The dynamic had changed, not through threat, but through definition. She was no longer negotiating upward. She was being concluded. Aurelia opened the folder fully and turned it so Briar could read without leaning forward. The page was brief, no legal language meant to impress, just decisions, stated plainly. Effective immediately, Aurelia said. Your role with the Foundation ends. Briar's breath caught. Terminated? Yes. For this? Briar asked, voice tightening. For one situation? Aurelia met her gaze. For repeated judgment failures tied to access you didn't earn? Briar shook her head. You're overcorrecting. This will follow me. It should, Aurelia replied calmly. Accountability isn't meant to be comfortable. She slid a second page forward. This outlines the boards and partner organizations where I sit. You will not be recommended or considered for roles within them. Briar's eyes widened. You're blacklisting me. I'm setting boundaries, Aurelia said. Reputation is built through choices. Networks respond to patterns. Briar leaned back, stunned. You don't have to do this. I do, Aurelia said. Because the work we do depends on trust, and trust requires consequences when it's breached. There was no triumph in her voice, no pleasure, just completion. Briar's shoulders sagged. I thought being close meant being valued. Being close means nothing without consent, Aurelia replied. And value doesn't come from proximity, it comes from conduct. This is a lesson many learn too late. Organizations don't fail because standards exist. They fail when standards are bent to accommodate ambition. Clear endings protect the people who remain. Aurelia closed the folder. You'll receive formal notice by end of day. Security will escort you out. Briar nodded slowly, the meaning finally settling. The room felt lighter, not because something was taken, but because something was finished. Briar stood slowly, the chair legs brushing the floor with a sound that felt louder than it should have. She gathered her bag, movements careful now, as if haste might undo what had already settled. I worked hard, she said, not looking up. I gave everything to this. I know, Aurelia replied. Effort wasn't the issue. Briar finally met her eyes. Then what was? Aurelia answered without hesitation. You confused opportunity with permission. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. I thought proximity meant trust, Briar said. That being included meant I belonged. Aurelia rose as well, closing the folder and placing it back on the table. Belonging is offered. It isn't taken. And trust is built through restraint as much as initiative. Briar nodded, a slow acknowledgement rather than agreement. I see that now. I hope so, Aurelia said. Because the lesson matters more than this outcome. They walked toward the door together, not side by side, but not in conflict either. At the threshold, Briar paused. I never meant to hurt you, she said. I believe that, Aurelia replied. And intent doesn't erase impact. Security waited just outside, unobtrusive, respectful. Briar stepped forward without protest. Before leaving, she turned once more. I thought access meant safety, she said quietly. Aurelia met her gaze, calm and steady. Access without boundaries is the opposite. The door closed behind Briar, the latch clicking softly into place. There's an education in this ending that extends beyond individuals. Access is not entitlement. Proximity is not permission. And when boundaries are enforced without cruelty, they don't destroy futures. They clarify how trust must be earned. Aurelia returned to the conference room alone, the glass walls reflecting nothing but her own stillness. The loop was closed. The divorce papers arrived without ceremony, delivered by courier to Aurelia's office late one afternoon. She signed for them herself, thanked the messenger, and returned to her desk before opening the envelope. Some things didn't require an audience. Her lawyer's voice came through the speakerphone minutes later. Given the documentation and the prenuptial terms, this will move quickly, he said. There's little room for dispute. That's fine, Aurelia replied. Speed isn't cruelty. It's clarity. Across town, Silas was discovering what clarity felt like when it arrived without warning. His attorney requested extensions that weren't granted. Motions meant to slow the process were denied. The court treated the matter as administrative rather than emotional, and that distinction mattered. During the first hearing, Silas leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "This feels rushed." The lawyer replied quietly, "That's what happens when agreements are clear." Aurelia watched from her seat, posture composed, hands folded. She didn't look at Silas when his name was read. She didn't need to. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about conclusion. The judge reviewed the terms efficiently. Assets, property, separation of interests. No speeches, no commentary. Outside the courtroom, Silas finally spoke to her. "You really won't fight this." "I already did," Aurelia said. "Years ago. On paper. There's a lesson embedded in how this unfolded. When boundaries are formalized early, endings don't require emotional negotiation. Betrayal often survives on the hope of delay, on the belief that forgiveness will soften consequences. When that belief is removed, process takes over. Aurelia walked past him without another word, the echo of her steps steady. The marriage was ending the way it had truly failed, not with chaos, but with precision. The board meeting was scheduled for 40 minutes. It ended in 12. Silas sat at the far end of the table this time, not by design, but by default. The seat he once occupied, central commanding, had been reassigned without comment. When the chair cleared his throat, the room settled. "We'll move directly to the governance item," she said. Effective immediately. No one looked at Silas. The language was precise. Interim leadership, fiduciary responsibility, reputational alignment. Each phrase carried weight without emotion. When the vote was called, hands rose quickly, almost uniformly. Silas finally spoke. "I deserve a chance to respond." The chair met his eyes. "You had one. The organization has to move forward." A pause followed. Not awkward. Conclusive. After the meeting, Silas approached one of the longest-serving members. "You know me," he said. "This doesn't define my work." The member sighed. "It defines risk," he replied. "And risk defines policy." That was it. Aurelia learned of the decision through an email forwarded by counsel. She read it once, then archived it. There was no satisfaction in it, only confirmation. Systems behave predictably when trust is compromised. They close ranks. They choose continuity. Silas called that evening. They didn't even debate it. "They did," Aurelia said, "just not out loud. There's an education here that often gets missed. Leadership doesn't fall because of judgment alone. It falls because confidence erodes. Once people stop trusting your restraint, they stop trusting your decisions." Aurelia ended the call and looked out at the city, light steady, indifferent. The alignment had shifted, and it would not shift back. They met in a quiet conference room neither of them had chosen. Neutral space, no history attached to the walls. Aurelia arrived first and remained standing. When Silas entered, he paused, as if expecting something unsaid to meet him halfway. "This didn't have to go this far," he began. Aurelia didn't sit. It went exactly as far as it needed to. He exhaled, frustration thinning into something closer to pleading. "I made a mistake. People do. You know that." "I know patterns," Aurelia replied, "and I know when apologies arrive only after consequences." Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You could have forgiven me. We could have worked through this. Forgiveness isn't permission to continue," she said evenly. "And reconciliation isn't owed." He shook his head. "You're punishing me." "I'm refusing to rescue you from outcomes," Aurelia said. "There's a difference." Silas's shoulders dropped. "So that's it?" "Yes," she said. "This is where it ends." He searched her face for hesitation and found none. "You're really walking away." "I already did," Aurelia replied. "I just stopped explaining it." Silence settled, clean and unarguable. She picked up her folder, not as a gesture, but as a signal that time had concluded. "There's something you should understand," Aurelia added, turning once more. "Betrayal survives on the belief that forgiveness is automatic. When that belief disappears, so does its power. Silas said nothing. Aurelia opened the door and left without looking back. Some conversations don't need closure. They need an ending. The apartment felt different without effort being applied to it. Aurelia noticed it the first evening she returned alone. Keys set down exactly where she liked them, lights left at the level that suited her eyes, rather than someone else's habits. Nothing echoed, nothing waited for explanation. The quiet wasn't empty, it was complete. She poured a glass of water and stood by the window. City lights spread wide below. For the first time in months, her body wasn't anticipating interruption. There were no calls to manage, no moods to translate, no silence to soften. Just presence, uninterrupted. A message arrived from an unknown number. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Whatever it contained belonged to a life already concluded. There's a truth that often arrives late. Freedom isn't the absence of relationship. It's the absence of self-betrayal. Aurelia hadn't lost a marriage in one night. She had regained herself over many quiet decisions, each one choosing honesty over comfort. She moved through the apartment, touching familiar surfaces with new ownership. Not possession, agency. The space no longer held negotiations or expectations disguised as peace. In the bedroom, she opened the window slightly and let fresh air move through the room. It carried nothing old with it. That mattered. Aurelia sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one final acknowledgement, not grief, not relief, but respect for the version of herself who finally stopped asking permission to leave what no longer honored her. Alone did not mean abandoned. It meant unbound. And for the first time in a long while, Aurelia slept without rehearsing tomorrow. Months passed without announcement. No milestones marked them, no calendar pages circled in ink. Change arrived quietly, through repetition rather than resolution. Aurelia's mornings found a new rhythm. She woke without checking her phone first. Coffee was taken on the balcony now, not rushed, not shared, steam lifting into air that felt unclaimed. Work followed, but it no longer consumed the edges of her day. She left the office when she intended to. She ate when she was hungry. She rested without justifying it. "You seem lighter," a colleague remarked one afternoon as they walked toward the elevator. "I'm more precise," Aurelia replied, a small smile settling where effort used to live. Her identity had shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. She no longer introduced herself through association. Her name stood on its own again, attached to work she chose rather than managed. Invitations came differently now, direct, considered, without assumptions about availability or role. At home, the apartment reflected her pace. Fewer things, clear surfaces, space that didn't ask to be filled, silence that didn't require translation. One evening, as she prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with a message from a friend. "You've been quiet lately. Are you okay?" Aurelia typed back, "I'm better than okay. I'm settled." That word mattered. There's an understated lesson in this stage of healing. Recovery doesn't always look like renewal. Sometimes it looks like removal of noise, of urgency, of identities built around endurance rather than choice. Growth often happens when life becomes simpler, not fuller. Aurelia washed the last dish and turned off the light, moving through her space without hesitation. She was no longer rebuilding what had broken. She was inhabiting what had been waiting. The balcony had become her anchor. In the early evenings, Aurelia stepped outside with a glass of water or tea, not to think, but to be present. The city moved below in steady patterns, cars flowing, lights shifting, distant voices rising and fading without demand. She rested her forearms on the railing and let the day release its grip without commentary. At first, stillness had felt unfamiliar, too open, too quiet. She had been accustomed to filling space, to anticipating needs before they formed. Now, she allowed silence to exist without correcting it. "You're not hiding, are you?" Her sister asked once during a call, concern layered beneath affection. "No," Aurelia replied. "I'm resting." There was a pause. "Those aren't the same thing," her sister said. "That's why I'm learning the difference," Aurelia answered. On the balcony, she noticed how her breathing settled on its own. No effort required. The body, given permission, knew how to regulate itself. Strength, she realized, didn't always look like motion. Sometimes it looked like staying put without anxiety. She remembered how often she had confused responsiveness with care, availability with loyalty. The quiet evenings corrected that misunderstanding gently. They taught her that presence does not require performance. There's an education in this stillness that rarely makes headlines. Healing doesn't demand constant introspection. It asks for consistency. A place where your nervous system can learn, again and again, that it is safe not to brace. One night, as the city lights reflected faintly off the glass door behind her, Aurelia caught her reflection. Her posture was relaxed, her expression unguarded, not triumphant, not fragile, balanced. She finished her tea and went back inside, leaving the balcony door open, just enough to let air circulate. The space no longer felt transitional. It felt claimed. The message arrived late, long after Aurelia had stopped expecting anything from that number. She noticed it only because her phone lit up while she was closing the balcony door. One notification, no urgency. Just a name she hadn't seen in months. "I ruined everything," Silas wrote. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I see it now." Aurelia sat on the edge of the couch, phone resting loosely in her hand. She read the message once, then again, not because it pulled at her, but because she wanted to be certain she understood what it was, and what it wasn't. It wasn't accountability. It was awareness, arriving late and asking to be witnessed. Her phone buzzed again. "I think about you all the time," he added, "about how you handled things. I should have listened." Aurelia exhaled slowly. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel tenderness. What she felt was separation, the clear kind that doesn't require defense. She typed her response carefully, not to soften it, not to sharpen it. "You didn't ruin everything," she wrote. "You revealed what I was already carrying alone. I hope you learn from it. I'm not part of what comes next." She read it once, then sent it. Silas replied almost immediately. "Can we talk? Just once." Aurelia set the phone down without answering. There's an important distinction in moments like this. Closure isn't achieved by revisiting the past until it sounds different. It's achieved by recognizing when understanding arrives without responsibility attached, and choosing not to adopt it. Silas's message didn't hurt her. It didn't heal her either. It simply confirmed that growth, when delayed, often asks for proximity it hasn't earned. Aurelia stood and returned to the balcony, the city unchanged, steady in its movement. She didn't carry the phone with her this time. Some messages are meant to be read. Not all of them are meant to be continued. Aurelia didn't block Silas immediately. She waited until the next morning, not out of hesitation, but intention. She wanted the choice to be clear, unreactive. After breakfast, she sat at the small table by the window and unlocked her phone. Silas's name still sat at the top of the thread. Quiet now, waiting. She opened the contact settings and scrolled without urgency. "You're not doing this to hurt him," she said aloud, hearing the truth as she spoke it. She tapped block. The action was silent, no confirmation message, no finality beyond what she decided it meant. What followed surprised her, not relief, not sadness, but space. Mental, emotional, practical. The absence of a channel where expectation could travel. The absence of interruption disguised as connection. There's a lesson here that deserves clarity. Blocking isn't cruelty. It's boundary maintenance. It's recognizing when communication no longer serves understanding, only access. Ending access isn't punishment. It's alignment. Later that afternoon, she met a friend for coffee. As they stood to leave, the friend paused. "You seem open," she said, searching for the word. "I am," Aurelia replied, "just not available to the past." That evening, she returned to the balcony one last time before night fully set in. The air felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing outside had changed. What had changed was internal. The tension she once carried had nowhere to attach itself. Aurelia leaned on the railing and let the quiet settle. Not emptiness, possibility. Space had opened, not for replacement, not for distraction, but for whatever came next to arrive without comparison. She turned back inside and closed the door gently behind her. The chapter was complete, and the future, finally, had room to speak. They met without ceremony. Aurelia was leaving a small bookstore near her office, a place she visited often now, when she realized she'd left her notebook at the counter. She turned back, just as someone else reached for it. "I think this is yours," he said, holding it out with an apologetic smile, as if the mistake belonged to him. "Thank you," Aurelia replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "I'm usually more careful. No harm done," he said. Some things want to be found twice. They stood there a moment longer than necessary. Not awkward, unrushed. "I'm Eli," he added, offering his name without expectation. "Aurelia." He nodded, as if committing it to memory. "You come here often?" "Enough to know where the quiet shelves are," she said. He smiled. "Same." They walked out together, not exchanging numbers, not promising anything, just sharing the sidewalk for a few steps before heading in different directions. What struck Aurelia later wasn't attraction in the traditional sense. It was presence. He hadn't asked what she did, or who she knew, or why she looked the way she did. He had simply noticed her, then let the moment be what it was. There's an understated lesson in encounters like this. After noise, attention feels radical. After performance, sincerity feels grounding. Sometimes the most meaningful beginnings don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, asking only to be met honestly. Aurelia watched him disappear into the crowd and kept walking, her steps unhurried. Something had shifted, not forward, not backward, just open. They met again a week later, by coincidence that didn't try to disguise itself. Same bookstore. Same late afternoon quiet. Eli was flipping through a paperback near the window when he looked up and recognized her. "Notebook retrieved safely this time?" he asked. Aurelia smiled. "I've learned." They ended up at the small cafe next door, seated by a table that caught the light without demanding it. Conversation moved easily, unforced. He asked about books she returned to when clarity mattered. She asked what he did when a day felt too loud. "I fix things," he said, "not for a living, just because it helps me listen." "Listen to what?" she asked. "Whatever I've been avoiding," he replied, then shrugged. "You." "I learned to stop correcting silence," Aurelia said. "It turns out, silence doesn't need managing." He considered that. "Do you believe in second chances?" The question arrived without weight, as if it didn't require performance. "I believe in honest ones," Aurelia said. "The kind that don't ask you to forget who you became the first time." He nodded. "That seems fair." There was no promise in the air, no urgency to define anything. Just agreement that growth doesn't ask for speed, only sincerity. Here's the quiet lesson this moment carried. Second chances aren't about repeating hope, they're about raising standards. When presence replaces projection, connection stops feeling like risk. They paid separately and stood, unhurried. "See you around?" he asked. "Maybe," Aurelia said. "If the moment earns it," and it felt like it might. Aurelia noticed the difference not in what she felt, but in what she no longer negotiated. With Eli, there was no urge to anticipate moods or soften truths. She didn't edit her thoughts mid-sentence or translate her silence into reassurance. When she spoke, she was heard. When she paused, nothing rushed to fill the space. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street after coffee, he said, "You don't talk much about your past." "I don't need to," Aurelia replied. It did its work. He nodded, accepting the answer without curiosity disguised as concern. "That's rare," he said. "Most people want to be understood before they're honest." "I learned to reverse that order," she said. "Honesty first. Understanding follows, or it doesn't." He smiled, not impressed, just present. "That makes things simpler." "Yes," Aurelia agreed. "Not easier, just cleaner." She realized then that her standards hadn't hardened. They had clarified. She wasn't guarding herself against harm. She was aligning with truth. The difference mattered. One is defensive. The other is discerning. There's an important takeaway here. Growth doesn't always announce itself through new beginnings. Sometimes it shows up as the absence of old patterns, the quiet refusal to shrink, overextend, or explain what should be respected by default. As they reached the corner where their paths split, Eli said, "I like how you move through the world." Aurelia met his gaze, steady. "I do too." And for the first time, that wasn't something she was trying to convince herself of. They didn't label anything. That was part of the ease. On a quiet evening, they sat on opposite sides of a small table, steam rising from mugs they hadn't rushed to drink. Eli glanced at her phone when it lit briefly, then looked away without comment. "You don't feel the need to explain," he said, more observation than question. "I don't," Aurelia replied. "Not anymore." He nodded. "That tells me enough." She noticed how different that felt, being trusted without interrogation, being met without audit. It wasn't intensity, it was steadiness, the kind that doesn't demand proof of worth. "Do you ever miss the noise?" he asked. "No," she said after a beat. "I miss who I thought I had to be to survive it, and I don't need her anymore." He smiled. "That sounds like growth." "It sounds like rest," Aurelia said. They talked about ordinary things after that: work days, favorite corners of the city, books that stayed with you longer than expected. Nothing about status, nothing about image, just presence, shared without performance. If this story has felt familiar at any point, if quiet strength, boundaries, or choosing truth over approval has resonated, sharing it with someone who might need it keeps conversations like this alive. Some stories don't ask for applause, they ask to be passed on. Aurelia stood to leave, unhurried. "See you soon?" Eli smiled. "If it stays honest, that's the standard," she said. Aurelia walked home alone that night, the city familiar and newly generous at the same time. Not because anything around her had changed, but because she no longer measured herself against it. The weight she once carried, of reputation, expectation, performance, had been set down quietly without ceremony. She paused at a crossing, hands in her coat pockets, watching the light shift. There was no rush to define what might come next, no urgency to secure happiness before it slipped away. She had learned that what's real doesn't need chasing. It remains. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend who had been following the story from a distance. "You okay these days?" Aurelia replied simply, "I'm steady." That word mattered more than joy ever had. There's a truth worth leaving with, especially if this story felt close to home. Betrayal doesn't always end in shouting matches or dramatic exits. More often, it ends when someone stops explaining themselves and lets consequences take their proper shape. Growth isn't loud, it's consistent, and dignity doesn't demand recognition, it sustains itself. If this story stayed with you, if it mirrored something you've lived or are still navigating, passing it along keeps its quiet lessons moving. And staying connected means you won't miss the next one when it arrives. Aurelia unlocked her door and stepped inside, the space welcoming her without condition. Whatever came next would meet standards shaped by truth, not status. Consequences don't always shout. Sometimes they simply arrive and stay.